uppercut, try to hit me in the gut, thinking that I won't react. You whisper in my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home. Begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. You're crying danger in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round. Oh, 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 yeah. First round, fifth round, final round. No, 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 no. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, oh, oh,
Hey Nick, Sean Spicer. I understand there's some controversy brewing about how many subscribers you have on YouTube. You have more subscribers than anybody. And it's probably the biggest, largest YouTube subscription that anybody's had. But also, it's not numbers that matter, Nick. And I know everyone's gonna quibble over this, but it's content, it's quality, and your subscribers are amazing. They're great. They're high quality subscribers, and that's really what you have to look at. Don't just focus on the numbers. I mean, if people are spewing a bunch of fake news, just don't get in the mud. They're amazing folks. Their engagement, the way that they like the videos. Anyway, I hope this puts this to the end. I hope that this controversy is over, and we know who the real YouTube subscriber champ is, and it's you, Nick.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter, and this is In Time. Thank you so much for joining us. Operator Starsky is not available at the present moment. We did speak with him around 1:30 p.m., so about 90 minutes ago, and he did confirm. Apologies if you can hear the dog. Hopefully, he'll come down in a minute. But he did appear to confirm that he'd be. Oh, is there an echo? Yeah, I know what's causing that. Apologies. That should deal with the echo. So. We spoke with him about 2 hours ago, and he appeared to be ready for the show, but we have not heard from him since. So I've tried to check in with him. We haven't heard from him. That is not uncommon. Those of you who watch this frequently know that about a third of the time something happens. He has to drive home, and it turns out that his Waze is a great traffic app, but does not account for incoming artillery and rockets. It's not the perfect app. So, okay, still echoing. That's interesting. All right. Out of curiosity, how bad is the echo? Okay, I'll try one thing. With any luck, that will deal with the echo. If it doesn't, I will try it. Oh, no, okay, maybe somebody has two versions open. So, all right. No worries. So it looks like the echo has been dealt with. Thank you. So having said that, we are prepared to go on without him. We're still hoping he will show up any minute, and he does oftentimes show up 5 or 10 minutes late. So with luck, we will be seeing him shortly. Until then, we have Commander Lance McMillan with us. Commander, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So, what has been going on? It's been an interesting week, and we already had a show covering Turkey. Looked like it was going to do something rather extraordinary. They seem to have backed off from that, but we're still keeping an eye on that. But it's been an extraordinary week nonetheless. What's been going on for this week in Ukraine?
Well, the front lines are still doing that slow incremental inching forward on the Ukrainian side, but they haven't achieved what everybody's hoping will happen, which is a major breakthrough. We still see no signs that they have committed a significant portion of that large reserve of specially equipped, specially trained brigades that they've been husbanding for exploiting said breakthrough. So it seems to me that they still have plans to do something with that. There have been rumors that the Russians are staging troops up in the north, or sending them into Belarus, what have you. So there'll likely be a certain degree of reluctance to fully commit reserves, even if they do get a breakthrough, in case some new offensive materializes from that direction, assuming that their intelligence corroborates that there's actually something there. A lot of what may be there is smoke and mirrors kind of stuff, that the Russians are really good at trying to pretend that, oh yeah, we have these hundreds of thousands of troops to move around. And you wonder, well, if you have all these guys and all the equipment for them, why aren't they at the front where they would be useful? Why are they, in this vague sense of, oh yeah, they're up north, okay.
Well, they have. My understanding is they have at least, what is it, about 200,000 troops that aren't usually considered in the numbers in Ukraine, but that's because most of those troops are 6 feet below surface level. At any rate, yeah, bad joke, I know, but I'm getting more and more cynical about this as it continues. So, yeah, presumably they do have a force of about 100,000 that they've amassed, and my understanding is the intelligence seems to indicate that they really do have it, but what they're doing with them, I don't know. We do know that the bridge between Crimea and Russia was hit. What can you tell us about that?
What actually hit it hasn't been confirmed. I've seen reports that it was more of the drone boats. I've heard reports that it was a storm shadow, that it was some other system. Regardless, it's proof, so to speak, that the Ukrainians do have the ability to reach out and touch the bridge, even though the front lines haven't advanced a significant amount towards Azov shore. So the other thing that people have wondered about is, why didn't they take the bridge out entirely if they have that capability? First off, they may have the capability, but a bridge is a pretty robust structure, and it's hard to take it out with warheads that are only 1,000 pounds or so for most of these weapons that we're talking about. Secondly, it actually works to their benefit to some degree to leave at least some way for the Russians who are in the Crimea to leave. It simplifies the equation both when conducting an assault to try to retake the Crimea, and it also means that post liberation, you don't have to contend with a lot of disgruntled, angry Russians who could become a fifth column. So that kind of may be one of the reasons why the bridge wasn't totally taken out.
If I could ask you to maybe try to move your mic a little closer to your mouth, I think that we may get a little clearer audio out of that. Much better. Absolutely. Thank you. So,
okay, I'll speak up a little louder too.
All right. Oh, good. Thank you. So, Bo the Fifth Column was talking about that, and he actually said that this was very concerning that they were striking the bridge because basically for the last 2,000 years of warfare, it's been understood that unlike the movies where, in the movies, it's like you surround them and then you eliminate all the bad guys and, oh, hey, you've won. He's like, really, it's in your best interest to allow them to retreat and get the fuck out of there if they can. And that in his view, this indicated a change in tactics and a increasing cynicism in Ukraine of actually trying to wipe all of them out. Is that your impression based on the scale of damage that you've seen?
I don't know. Honestly, I really can't say. I mean, the idea of leaving your opponent a route to retreat has been talked about as far back as Caesar. Also, Napoleon says it, Sun Tzu says it, Clausewitz says it. Because if you surround an opponent entirely where he can't retreat, then he has really no option but to fight to the death. As long as that retreat route is open, no matter how dangerous and exposed it may be, there's a likelihood and a probability that they're all going to start trying to get out of there before they get killed or captured. So, yeah, trying to completely knock out the bridge may not be in Ukraine's best interest, but disabling it to the point where it's difficult for them to get substantial supplies into Crimea is probably a good thing.
And I should have done this at the beginning. I try to do this at least once every 4 or 5 shows. I haven't done it in a while. I'm going to ask you a question, but before I do, I'm going to get your CV real quick. No, I'm going to ask you before I let you answer the question, I'm going to get your CV. The question is, so somebody had mentioned in the live chat, and I think we hear a lot of this, is in your view, the Ukrainian offensive failing? We've had a number of different talks about that. You and I have talked about that. We've talked about that on air a few times, but I think that's a good question, so I'd like to address that. But before we do, could you remind our audience of your background in regards to the military?
Sure. I'm a retired U.S. Navy officer. My specialties were in operational logistics and amphibious operations, so I'm quite familiar with the whole ground side of the game. I'm a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College, the U.S. Staff and Command College. I'm a fully certified Joint Specialty Officer. That pretty much covers that part of it, the educational side. I was also the primary logistics planner for the inflow of U.S. ground forces into Kuwait in preparation for Operation Iraqi Freedom. So that's my field experience, if you will. I've been a student of military history since I was, as they jokingly say, knee-high to a grasshopper. So, I'm very familiar with this kind of stuff. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I leave that to people like General Hodges. But yeah, I'm certainly familiar with it, and I think I do have a certain degree of ability to make comments and projections.
Well, and to be fair, when we had General Hodges on, I asked him questions I'd asked you, and about 90% of the time he echoed what you did, and usually when he didn't, there just ended up being more nuance in it that you later had given to me in private. So you two seem to be pretty much on the same page. We will be having Lieutenant General Benjamin Hodges back on for the last Monday and Thursday in August. I think that's the 27th and the 30th. So look forward to that. So when somebody says, and I do get the sentiment, we had all been expecting, oh my God, as soon as the offensive starts, we're going to see these massive gains. When somebody says to you, the offensive is failing, or what is your response?
I would say the offensive is not progressing as rapidly as many people would like. And I'm sure many people include Zelensky and the Ukrainian General Staff, but that does not mean that it's failing. The key issue here is the Russians had probably about 4 to 5 months to prepare the ground that they are currently defending. So they have vast trench and bunker systems. They have lots and lots of minefields. They have razor wire to complicate moving infantry into the positions to clear them, etc. So the Ukrainians are being, in my opinion, very smart by advancing carefully to minimize their own losses, because in the attack, you can expect, even in a good situation, the attacker is going to take significantly higher losses than the defender. And that's kind of proven by what happened in the early part of this war. A large force of Russians attacked, and a not particularly well prepared Ukrainian defense literally slaughters them. So that's the kind of thing they want to avoid. They don't want to lose that big reserve I was talking about prematurely, so to speak. They want to hold that reserve. They want to make sure that what they have is the ability to create a breach in the Russian line somewhere so they can exploit it. There are about 10 sectors all over the, from north down to this, near Kherson. There are sectors that the Ukrainians are probing. They're sending out small groups looking for weaknesses in the Russian lines. If they find them, they exploit them to try to take ground, to get through some of these very dense defensive belts that the Russians have. That's kind of what's going on right now. It also forces the Russians, as we were talking earlier, that they had, perhaps 100,000 Russian reserves somewhere. It's forcing the Russians to keep shuttling those reserves around as these probes meet with limited success. That tires them out, that wears out their equipment, that uses up supplies, so that when that eventual breach occurs, and I have no doubt in my mind that that's going to happen at some point, hopefully sooner than later, but you never know. But when that breach occurs, the Russian reserves will already be so discombobulated, so tired, so short of supply, that any counterattack they stage to try to repel the Ukrainian offensive will be of limited value. So I think they're doing a very good job. And I mean, people who've seen this show before, until fairly recently, I used to say, no, the offensive hasn't even started yet. that's a misspeak, but I want to make sure that people understand. Yeah, the offensive is begun. It began probably back in early June, but the idea is that they haven't thrown those forces in. You're not getting that big bold arrow that crosses giant swaths of the map, because they're still trying to find an area that they can establish a viable breach in the Russian lines. Hope that clarifies the situation.
All right, so if I can understand, and this is what you had said we could expect, and you also said that we could expect that once it really begins in earnest, that's when we're going to see the huge growth. But it depends on what you call the offensive, or have they started an offensive? Yes, but it's really mostly, from what I understand from you here, is what we're looking at is probing attacks, mostly to see where they're weakest. Once they find a place where they can break through, or where they do break through, that's when the bulk of the reserve forces, which have been waiting patiently to go in, just pour through whatever that hole is, and that's when quote the offensive, the big one that we've been waiting for, presumably begins. Is that roughly accurate?
That's a pretty accurate statement. The key here is that the Ukrainians could commit the bulk of their reserves right now, but it risks having a situation like you saw on the Western Front in World War I. They slam their heads against a well-entrenched, well-fortified position, take hideous losses, and then they don't have the ability to really mount an offensive that they can exploit. And then it was the whole World War I over-the-top crossing no man's land thing. That's a great way to lose a lot of people for little gain. But if you do what the Ukrainians are doing right now, you're making those little gains, but you're not taking heavy losses. And potentially you're creating conditions that will allow you to create that breach.
That does seem very advanced, and coming from a military that is not as experienced as we would expect the Ukrainian military to be. Where do you think they're getting the idea to operate this way from?
NATO, excuse me. I'm sorry. I had something in my throat.
Okay, so yeah, I'm getting this. NATO. Okay, yeah. Oh, wow, that is a bad one. It's contagious.
Yeah, it's bad. It's a bad little cough.
And I have to.
I think they're getting very deep briefings through NATO or through the U.S., getting intelligence about what the Russians are doing, where their forces are, what their reserves are. All of that's going on, so they're able to operate at a much higher level than you would otherwise expect. I'm not trying to say that the Ukrainian army without our aid would be incompetent. I don't think that's the case. After 2014, the Ukrainians realized the danger they were in, and they started working very closely with NATO countries, not the alliance itself, because they weren't part of it, but individual countries getting training missions in. They supported UN operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, so that gave their troops some experience. Those experienced personnel come home, they get promoted into an NCO corps, into a junior officer corps that can effectively lead troops in combat. And they understand the way we fight as opposed to the much more methodical, stodgy Russian way of approaching the offensive.
We do have two super chats, and one of them leads into one of the questions I want to ask you anyway. So let's $5 Canadian from Garth 𝐒𝐚𝐬. Gherkin has found himself in a bit of a pickle. The KGB has him in a jar. So what do you know about Gherkin and or anything else pertaining to the whole Wagner situation and the uprising?
So Wagner's little, I don't know, there's so many terms you can throw at, and I don't think any of them really match what happens. It wasn't a coup per se. It may have been a mutiny. It has definitely some elements of the mutiny. It could have just been a demonstration. I don't really know how to categorize it. The key is that the fallout from his little enterprise is that some of his operation has been moved to Belarus. And when I say some, I really want to emphasize that. It's not the whole thing. The 25,000 or so Wagnerite forces that were on the front lines in Ukraine did not all immediately pack up and go to Ukraine. Depending on whose reports you believe, it may be as few as about 7,000, could be as high as 15. A large portion of people from the ex-Wagner forces got reincorporated into the Russian army's ranks. They were allowed to sign contracts. And a fair number of them just said, I've had enough of this crap, and went home. So there's that. The heavy equipment that they were operating with apparently was like on loan from the Russian military, and they were forced in most cases to turn that back over to the Russians, the Russian army, I should say. And that will probably be used to help re-equip the Russian army, because as we've talked about before, they're increasingly have to stick their hand deeper and deeper into their pool of old vehicles and old equipment. And Wagner kind of had a lot of fairly modern stuff that they were using. They were one of the priorities for all the good gear. So that stuff, now that it's freed up, can be given to help try to re-equip some of the better Russian units, I would presume.
I think Titan said this. I like this. So we're from now on, let's call it a field trip, right? So Prigozhin, Prigozhin's just like, hey everybody, we're going on a field trip. We're going to go see Moscow. Let's just have a good, yeah.
Yeah, and some of the kids got away from the chaperones and partied in Rostov, and
mistakes were made. Oh dear Lord! All right, so yeah, I think okay, the field trip. All right, so that's what we're gonna call it from now on. I have just quickly.
That's brilliant.
I like that. I have just reached out to Starsky again real quick. I just used the voice, but I muted myself for it, but I want to do that because it's the only way to talk rapidly. But we'll see what he has to say. Like I said, I spoke to him over 2 hours ago. And my assumption is usually when he doesn't get back to me, what it means is, look, he could easily be in a shelter. You know, if missiles showed up, he's got to go into a shelter, and you know he's not going to get cell reception for a little while. So these things happen. He is going to be on the shills tomorrow. Presumably, he misses them on occasion too. I'm going to try to make it on the shills. I know you try to make it, so I hope people will go check that out. We're going to keep, I think we still have a lot to cover, and we still are cautiously optimistic that he's going to make it, and we'll be able to ask him some questions when he gets here. So we're going to hold out for that. As usual,
anyway,
for all...
back to the original question. Yes. Gherkin did get arrested.
Yes.
I think there was kind of a pre-trial indictment sort of thing. I'm not that familiar with Russian legal system, but we have pictures of him actually standing before a magistrate and such. I don't know really what the charges are beyond, saying things that were critical of the regime or the war effort or what have you, which, depending on how powerful you are, can be either a very severe threat or a relatively minor threat to you. So it depends on how much influence he and his allies are able to exert to keep bad things from happening to him.
I'm going to make a correction. Somebody in the live chat said that he missed the shills once. He's actually missed the shills 3 times, at least 3 that I know of. And the reason I know is because those were times I was supposed to be on the show. So I'm starting to see a correlation. I'm just saying. If I tell Dick I can't make it, there's Starsky. All right. So
you did remember to use deodorant, right?
You know what? On reflection, a lot of my last week suddenly makes a lot more sense when I think about it. Since I got back from vacation, I don't really think, you know what? I may have some apologies to issue. I will have to get back to that. Okay, oh, Dick's there too. Okay, good. Now I can really start to make fun of the shills. There's really, honestly, nobody here, please, needs to make fun of the shills until Dick shows up. Once he shows up, so save it. Just save it. He shows up, all out. It's pointless until he's here. All right, and then
save it and savor it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Level 70, 1399 Canadian. Russia said they will inspect all cargo ships in the Black Sea or sink them. This sounds familiar. This is reminds me of Cuba. I can't see Turkey and Romania. Let's see. I think he's probably said comply. He's yeah. And Romania accepting this violation of international law. How will NATO respond? And this actually, okay, we're now going to have to talk about the whole Black Sea, which is also very much up your alley. So before we do, thank you very much for the super chats. A reminder, whether Starsky is here or not, all Starsky shows, all of the income we get from super chats, all of it goes to the a charity of Starsky's choice. He has chosen the Vatra Volunteer Organization, which pays for bulletproof vests and various supplies for frontline troops, including Starsky's own unit. So Ali has just dropped the Vatra Volunteer PayPal. You should also be able to find all of their information in the description for this show, but all the super chats from these Starsky updates go straight to that organization, and we are very proud to be able to do that. It's a genuine privilege. So thank you for those of you who support us in doing that and who support them in doing that. So thank you all very much. So this leads us both to the grain and to the cargo shipments. So in whatever order suits you, let's talk about the grain problem and possible solutions, and this quarantine or whatever they're going to call it.
Right. So I don't know how to make this understandable, because it's a very complex and convoluted issue. So let's start with the Montreux Convention. The Montreux Convention was signed back in, I think it was the 1920s, and it governs passage of ships through the Turkish Straits. And to be clear, the Turkish Straits are a little different than many other straits that are governed by maritime law, because you actually, to transit the straits, there are two of them. There's the Dardanelles at the southern end and the Bosphorus at the northern end. And in between is the Sea of Marmara. So you're transiting through Turkish interior waters, not coastal waters, interior waters to their country. So it had to be covered to allow people, by the convention, to allow ships transit for trade purposes, but also to regulate whether military ships could and could not go out in and how that's done. The key is that, for the most part, only nations that have a coastline on the Black Sea are allowed to have military vessels within the Black Sea.
Okay.
There are exceptions. Every year, the U.S. tends to send a couple of ships in a, show the flag kind of thing. It's called freedom of navigation. And we do it with the Turkish government's permission. We pass through their territorial waters. But there are very strict limits on what kind of ships can go in and out, how large they can be. Submarines, we typically don't send submarines in, because according to the convention, submarines must transit straits on the surface. We don't like people to know where our submarines are, so transiting on the surface is something we would prefer to avoid. For the Russian part, when they built their proto-aircraft carriers and such, those were too large to be allowed through the straits. So they worked a deal with the Turks where they redesignated these ships as aviation cruisers, which would allow them to transit the straits. But Yeah, it's very closely regulated, and Turkey can do whatever it wants in terms of allowing people in and out.
Okay.
The key here is that when ships are trying to go through those straits and then go to Odessa to load grain, they have to get permission to pass through those straits. And what had been being done prior to the expiration last Monday of the grain arrangement was that a Russian inspection team in Istanbul would board those ships and certify those grain carrying ships as free of arms. In other words, they were not secretly taking artillery shells or tanks or whatever to the Ukrainians. When the arrangement expired, those inspectors were no longer resident. They're probably still there, honestly, but they're not inspecting ships that transit the straits. So what the Russians are saying that they intend to do is inspect ships on the high seas to verify that they are not carrying prescribed cargo. They haven't really said what constitutes prescribed cargo. Obvious military supplies going in, but they haven't indicated whether prescribed cargo includes Ukrainian grain going out. So that becomes an issue. What they're saying is that they intend to board grain or any shipping that they feel is appropriate to board before it goes into Odessa. And if you have your flag on a ship, that means they're violating your territorial integrity. You have to give permission to allow people to do that without a violation of your national sovereignty. So now we take another step into weird history. Sorry, but this is what I need to explain it so everybody fully understands the ramifications here. So back in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, both Iran and Iraq were sending ships, aircraft, and missiles out to sink one another's tankers, or actually not owned by their countries, but anybody's tankers that was carrying the other guy's oil.
Okay.
And for those of you who weren't around at the time, the price of oil in the U.S. spiked. There were giant lines at the gas pump, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the Reagan administration came up with this clever way of getting around this by saying, we're going to reflag 11 Kuwaiti supertankers. They are no longer going to be owned by Kuwait. They're going to be American-owned ships. This was all a legal facade, but it was within what goes for maritime law. That allowed the U.S. to escort these vessels, such that had any Iranian or Iraqi aircraft or boat tried to board or attack those ships, those aircraft or small boats that were trying to attack them would be attacking the U.S., and we could legally defend and destroy those ships that were threatening the U.S. tankers. Does that make sense?
It does.
So
yes.
the thinking is that perhaps there will be a regimen put in place where either the grain carriers are going to be reflagged as Turkish or American or who knows shipping, so that they can thereby be protected under international law by the forces of said nation. Now, obviously, this is my opinion, reflagging them as Turkish ships would make a lot more sense, because then you kind of circumvent that whole issue of who can transit and what size can transit into the Black Sea, which would affect American shipping. The other thing it does is, because Turkey's a member of NATO, if those are reflagged as Turkish ships and the Russians do something hostile against those ships, or if they were reflagged as American ships, if the same thing principle applies, they can invoke Article 5, and that becomes an attack on NATO, and everybody gets to go to war. Or at least initiate a proportional response. But what that is I'll leave to your imagination.
Well, and whatever we consider a proportionate response, they're going to see as an escalation. To us, it's proportionate because...
Absolutely.
So it's to them, it's an escalation because the original target was valid. So a couple of questions on that. It does look like Turkey is interested in doing something along those lines. We had what appeared to be confirmation from a Middle Eastern newspaper, and we talked about this at length last week. Actually, I think it was earlier this week, but that confirmation appears to have been rolled back. Nonetheless, it looks like they are interested in doing this. I assume one hesitation is that they think that there is a distinct possibility Russia will fire on it, and nobody wants to... I don't think anybody wants to trigger Article 5 if it can be avoided. What do you think is the likelihood that Russia will engage one of these vessels if it's either carrying the Turkish flag or is protected by Turkey?
I think that they would be more likely to push the Turks than if they were reflagged as American vessels. I think what they will really do is look for non-NATO member ships that are conducting that transit to try to get the grain and board and search them. I don't think it's so much a case they don't want the grain to go out. It's they want to be seen as being strong because of all the stuff that's going on. They're looking weaker and weaker to the world. More importantly, Putin's looking weaker and weaker to his own internal demographics and needs to present some way of saying, oh, look at me, I'm still the strong man. And boarding and or attacking some ship in the Black Sea is showing that audience that Russia is still big and powerful and a world power kind of thing. Now, I'm sure they realized the severe danger they would be in were they to shoot at a ship that was flagged by a NATO country. So I suspect that they will try to limit that. They will bluster. They will try to send, maybe some Coast Guard ship out or something to board and search one of these guys. And they'll get refused, and then they'll file complaints with the UN and go through the kabuki show. But could it escalate? Yeah, it damn well could. What would NATO do in response to such an action? That's a good question. There have been a lot of rumors floating around recently that the Russians have mined the approaches to Odessa and are going to, hope that a grain ship hits one, and then they can immediately say, oh, look, it's the Ukrainians. They're attacking the neutral shipping because nobody's going to believe that outside of Russia. But that's the key. The audience that all these actions are really being directed at is the Russian people. It's not at the international audience.
Roughly how much of the world's grain comes from Ukraine, and what happens if that supply gets suddenly cut off?
It's a very large portion, and it depends on who you talk to and which sources you're talking about and what specific agricultural products you're talking about. So all of that factors into it. But I would say somewhere in the vicinity of, I guess, 25 to perhaps 40% of all the agricultural product that a lot of particularly smaller third world countries in sub-Saharan Africa depend on comes out of Ukraine, or at least did. Now we know that when the war started, pardon?
No, I was. You had used the word "depend on," but I'll get back to that. Yes. I want you to finish. So it's not like optional.
They
It's
can't
not
really feed themselves without it.
okay.
So you're looking at a situation where, should those grain supplies dry up, famine ensues. And that means that you're going to get mass migration of people trying to get somewhere where they aren't starving. And that puts pressure on the southern tier of NATO, which may be one of the intentions of this Russian plan, is to force a mass migration, to force countries like France, Spain, Italy, Greece into rethinking their policy of opposing the Russian war and continuing to support Ukraine. Because if grain gets shipped, then you don't get those mass migrations and all those refugees living in your country, putting a strain on your social systems.
Well, and Turkey's really at the apex to that. So I'm curious if you think Turkey that may be one reason why Turkey is so heavily invested in talking about this, aside from the fact they also control the strait.
Absolutely. I think they want to keep things going. I mean, they get some money, but not a huge amount for fees charged through what goes through the strait. I believe it's roughly $4, $5 per deadweight ton of cargo that passes through that they get to charge a fee on. Plus, they have pilots that go on the boats as they transit them. They get a fee as well. So they make not inconsiderable money, but it's probably less than 0.5% of their GDP. So that's, pardon?
Oh yeah, no, I didn't realize. Yeah, okay. So yeah, it's not it's small relatively, but it's not negligible, is what it sounds like.
Right. Okay. Yeah. But there's definitely an issue that the Turks in that situation want to keep that commerce going, both because if you do get mass migration, there's a fair chance a lot of them are going to end up coming through Turkey. Remember what happened in Syria during the Civil War? And all those people, well, they came up through Turkey. And I think it's safe to speculate that if you get, countries like Libya or Sudan or Egypt having significant food shortage problems, people that are going to migrate are going to come up through Turkey. So they don't want that to happen. It also puts, as I said, stress on other countries, not just the Turks, but the Turks are kind of the focal point because everything goes through their straits. So they want it to continue. We know that the Turks were making a very strong effort in the week prior to the expiration of the grain deal to get a negotiated renewal of said deal. The Russians on, I think it was Friday of last week, basically said point blank, we aren't going to re-sign up. And they had done so multiple times prior to this. We're not going to re-sign on to the deal because the UN has basically been negotiating in bad faith because everything they promised us, they haven't given us. And that's open into interpretation, but regardless, that's the Russian position. So I think the takeaway is the Russians don't want the deal to continue for whatever reason, and the Turks do want the deal to continue for whatever reason. And obviously the Ukrainians do, because it's, their product is going out, so they make money on every ton of grain that gets shipped. So the question is, how far is Turkey willing to extend itself to ensure this continues? They're certainly in agreement or in accord with the Ukrainians on wanting this to continue. But they put themselves at some risk if they decide to start reflagging or escorting or what have you. I don't think the Russians be bold enough to actually mine the Turkish side of the straits. They're probably content with just mining the approaches to Odessa.
So it sounds like so Putin wanted a number of concessions from the UN, and I think actually largely from the U.S., but he's saying UN, but in particular, the return of the SWIFT banking system in certain agricultural areas, certain other economic areas, a number of economic sanctions to be released. So essentially, and it's kind of, we know that Putin is a sociopath, but it's still nonetheless. Yeah.
Right. The two big stumbling blocks were that, and the other one, which is almost mind-blowing when you think about it, is the world's largest ammonia pipeline passes from Russia into the Ukrainian port of Odessa.
Mm-hmm.
And those ammonia shipments, and just so people understand, ammonia is a very important agricultural product, or product. It's important to agriculture because it's used to make fertilizer. And this was one of the world's major sources of ammonia that came through that pipeline. When the war started, the pipeline obviously was shut down. The Russians want that reopened. Now, I want you to think about the absurdity of Ukraine allowing Russia to sell a product through a pipeline running through disputed territory and being shipped out of their port to the benefit of the Russians. You can see why that's going to be a really big hurdle to get approval on it.
All right. So, and I want to get to that too, because we've had that issue with the bridge, calling the Ukrainians terrorists for blowing up a bridge that's on their land that they did not build. But nonetheless, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So it looks like Putin basically has, from my understanding here, two possible gambits out of this, which is if he stops the grain, people want it enough that they're willing to negotiate and roll back some of the sanctions and allow Russia to make some more money in order to get the grain shipments through, or the starvation gets so bad that people start migrating to wherever there's food just to stay alive, start flooding the southern EU and or NATO countries, Turkey, other countries that you had mentioned earlier, Greece, and these countries now say, okay, it's having a dramatically negative impact on us, and presumably call up Ukraine and say, you need to end this, even if it comes to negotiation. We're going to pull our support because of the collateral damage that we're getting. That's essentially his play. One of those two.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about this before, and we have to be honest about it. The only reason Ukraine is able to continue resisting at the level they are doing is because NATO is giving them so much gear and supplies to be able to prosecute the war. If you get NATO pressured by human migration to where at least part of the alliance is saying, look, we need to stop this, those members who are most pressured will put more pressure on other members of the alliance, and eventually that aid may, I would argue, will start to dry up.
Well, it's an Overton window. He doesn't need to, he just is trying to push it enough that people are, when you add up all of the costs of the war, now including the damage that's being done, but it's a little, we've seen this before, but it's always difficult to see the, what is it, the literally deliberately starving people in order to make them pawns in your attempt to, and it's a huge, it's a little shocking, but it strikes me. Yeah, I think that's what we're looking at. So, Russia has called the attack on the bridge a terrorist, and there have been some people who've been saying that, okay, is Ukraine now, resorting to terrorist tactics by blowing up the bridge or doing anything like that. What's your view from a military standpoint on those kinds of claims?
From a law of war standpoint, I'm not talking ethics. I'm talking legal, international law about war. A valid military target can be attacked regardless of potential civilian collateral damage losses. And I think anybody would agree that the Kerch Bridge is a valid military target because not just supplies into the Crimea, but supplies coming out of Crimea to the southern sector of the Russian lines are all provided through that conduit. If the bridge is neutralized, damaged, destroyed, what have you, that constitutes a valid military act. Therefore, to my thinking from the legal aspect, it is not a terrorist act. Conversely, let's turn this argument on its head. Are the Russian attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine terrorist attacks? The argument that can be made on that side, I'm not saying I agree with it, but the argument can be made by attacking the power infrastructure of Ukraine. It impacts Ukraine's ability to use its railways, because the railways are like 80% electric, not diesel like we have in the US and Canada. It impacts the ability of the Ukrainians to use those rail networks to ship their forces around and keep their forces supplied. Ergo, attacking those power generators would be a valid military target.
Can they use the same argument with the grain shipments, saying that the grain shipments are in fact providing money to the war effort? So
it's the same argument that was made by us in World War II with the strategic bombing of Germany and Japan, with the submarine warfare campaign against Japan. I mean, Japan really was in a state of famine by the end of the war. We had literally cut off everything coming into the country, and what there was in the country was non-productive. People were dying in droves. So, is that terrorism? Depends on how you want to define terrorism. But from a strictly military legal standpoint, international law about law of war, those are valid targets.
Well, and I think it's worth pointing out, and somebody in the live chat, I think, said this, that the bridge was not technically bombed. It was a special explosive or special demolition operation. So it was not it was...
Don't do that when I have a mouthful of water.
So there's special demolition exactly. So we do have this. I guess the Washington Post has just reported this. Well, it's certainly today. Reported as of about 2 hours ago that yes, 𝐒𝐨𝐿 Gherkin, who is also known as Igor 𝐒𝐨𝐿𝐷𝐿, ex-FSB officer, is let's see, he's Russian authorities have detained him, a former Ukrainian prominent war blogger, on charges of promoting extremism. And we have had there was now he wasn't the one he's not the one that said that Putin was acting recklessly. There's a pro-Ukrainian blogger who just got arrested for saying that. Or sorry, not pro-Ukraine, pro-Russia, but he did criticize Putin.
I don't know specifically what Gherkin said. I don't follow him, so I can't say. I do know that a lot of the Russian mill bloggers have been egging on the Russian government and or military to use all means possible to prosecute the war. And we all know what that means when they're saying that. So if this guy was saying, something beyond just, I think we should use our nukes and our chemical weapons against the Ukrainians. If he was saying something along the lines of the government isn't doing what's necessary and causing losses because it's not doing what's necessary, and the government should be removed and more forceful nationalist Russians put in place, then what you have is, extremism, because he's advocating a regime change. And I think that's more likely than just saying, I think we should kill a lot more Ukrainians than we've been doing. That's a different, and he's not alone among people who've been saying that. So why would they single him out? I think to warrant him having to be arrested in a public fashion and then brought before a magistrate in a public fashion, it's trying to send a message. And what the question then becomes, what is the message? It's saying, I would think, not don't tell us how to prosecute the war. It's don't criticize the government. In an authoritarian regime like this, that's the way business is done.
Well, and it's interesting. They do actually tolerate a little bit of criticism, but only some people can get away with it. They know what the limits are, and they do it only so that they can say, oh, of course we tolerate criticism. Look at this guy who it's sort of it's very tepid and almost like backhanded or and now I think they're not.
You're the dedicated opposition or designated opposition.
Exactly. And I think even now those guys aren't speaking up, and the reason is because Putin looks weak as a result of the Wagner. So this is not the time, even if you're the designated opposition. It's like, I'm going to keep my mouth shut for a little while.
As I said several weeks ago, when the whole Prigozhin thing was at the top of the news, what you're seeing, I think, is kind of the start of the death spiral of the regime, because the what do you call it? The field trip exposed the regime as weak. And so to counteract that, they have to do stuff to make themselves look strong again, which causes people to criticize them for being, incompetent. And you get that circle effect going of, A leads to B, leads to C, leads back to A. And that's what we have going.
All right. So, well, I think one can only hope, but as you've pointed out more than once, it's like, well, you just hope that they get replaced by somebody who isn't worse than Putin. And it's hard to see where that would come from. All right. Well, were there any other things that you wanted to discuss? I know we talked about the show. All right. You had
there was one other thing I wanted to talk about. Earlier in the week, I'm sorry, I can't remember which day, but the Russians fired some missiles into Odessa and destroyed a 60,000-ton grain storage elevator. I did some research. The largest grain storage elevator, and it's one of several, has a capability of holding 108,000 tons of grain. So, depending on how you interpret what was said, even if this is a 60,000-ton standalone facility, you still have the big one that we've just talked about. And if it's the big one that lost 60,000 tons of grain storage capability, that still means that roughly 40,000 plus tons are functional. And there are other grain storage facilities. Plus, while Odessa is the main port, there are other smaller ports in that area that also act as grain shipment facilities. So, yes, the destruction of this one facility is probably important. The grain that was in it was lost as well. That doesn't mean that everything has been lost. The Ukrainians still have a capability to ship grain out. I think that's the important takeaway from this. The Russians have reduced the ability, but not eliminated.
Do you think that they're going to continue to escalate those kinds of attacks, especially if maybe attacking them on the high seas is not really going to be an option anymore?
Yeah, I think that as a cohesive NATO slant, Turkish slant, U.S. only, Turkish only, whatever, plan comes to more focus on how it's going to address the situation. If the Russians assess that they can't really compete against that protocol that's put in place, they may say, well, then the way to solve the problem is to simply destroy all the grain in the storage facilities in those ports. Then there's no real way for Ukraine to get the grain out, regardless.
All right. So for the next week, it sounds like one of the things we have to be watching for is what's going to happen with that grain, both in terms of being able to feed people, but in terms of also, is it going to put the U.S. and NATO into a possible Article 5 situation, especially if Turkey decides to guarantee those shipments in one way or another. So I think that's what we need to watch out for. We're still looking for any kind of break where the reserves would be able to push through and start the major combat offensive. Major
Exploitation.
Exploitation operation, we'll say. Against the Russians. And anything else that we need to be looking for the next week?
Not really. I kind of the little bit of blurry things that I can read about the chat stream here. Somebody saying, I don't trust Turkey. I will point something out that really needs to be said so people understand one of the key features of what's going on with the Turks and the grain shipment. When the deal was negotiated last year, Erdogan was one of the primary driving factors to bring it to fruition. He did so in large part because he wanted to come across as being, the brilliant statesman, etc. Why? Because he was facing parliamentary elections earlier this year. So he needed to establish himself and his party as the best people to elect because they're the ones that arranged this grain shipment deal, that continued maintaining peace in the region, etc. The elections are over. His party did lose some ground in parliament, in the Turkish parliament, but they still have control. So he no longer has an immediate pressing need to make himself big. He doesn't need to expose himself or his country if he doesn't see anything profitable for himself or his party. And without the pressing need of those elections, he may just be doing a look good PR thing of saying, oh yeah, I want these to continue. But he may decide, it's too risky. It's too costly. I'm not going to put myself on the line for the Ukrainians. Let the Americans take the lead.
That makes sense. All right. Well, the other piece of news for today is that the judge in the Donald J. Trump hearings case over the documents has set a court date as of earlier today for May 20th of next year. The prosecution had been hoping December. Meanwhile, Trump's team had been hoping after the elections next year. May 20th puts it right in the middle of the primaries for the RNC, so that's going to be cray-cray. I'd honestly rather sooner rather than later. It does less damage to the Republican Party that way and is less hilarious, but I think that this is something that is serious and needs to be resolved sooner rather than later. Nonetheless, the date has been set for the 20th. We also believe that there is a distinct possibility today, last time I think it was around 5 p.m., that New York indicted Donald Trump. He was also indicted in Florida on the on the documents charges. We are anticipating at any time a third indictment. We expect it will probably have in excess of 100 counts against him on a variety of charges. The charges are more broad than we had anticipated. I think it's probably going to be very big. We are waiting for it. We have some reason to believe it's going to happen today. If it doesn't, probably Monday. So we will be staying on that, and we will broadcast as soon as we know. So make sure you like, subscribe, hit the bell, and that makes it so that you hopefully will get the notifications. YouTube is notoriously poor with that, and we have suffered as much as any channel when it comes to people getting the notifications. Join us on our Discord, too, because we notify everybody of all the shows as they come out. I'd like to... So we have not yet heard from Starsky. I'm sure he's fine. A lot of things happen over there that is out of everyone's control, and he does miss shows. We are terribly sorry to have missed him, but we look forward to seeing him ostensibly tomorrow on the shills, and certainly next week at the same time. So hopefully we will be able to see him then. In the meantime, thank you so much, Commander McMillan, for joining us. Your insights have been extremely helpful, so we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And please do remember, liking really does help us. That's why we always ask. And believe me, every single creator feels like a prostitute when they're sitting there going, oh, please give us your likes. But we really do need them, and it helps in the algorithm. So please do hit that like button and subscribe. And we look forward to seeing you all at a minimum on Downtime with Commander McMillan next week, if we don't have a couple of in-time shows in the meantime. And then obviously Operator Starsky 1 week from today. Thank you all, and see you next week.